All right. Hi, everyone. I know it's just a little bit past the hour. We want to get started. We have a lot of great topics to cover today. My name is Aaron Pina. I am the chair of the Board on Representation, Accessibility, Inclusion, and Diversity. It's the name of the former board on women and minorities. It's no coincidence that this month marks the 75th year of the National Disability Employment Awareness Month. This also is the 30th year of the American Disabilities Act. In the American Meteorological Society, we've been working hard on improving accessibility to all society members to create a more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible field of meteorology. So to address accessibility issues, we must educate ourselves by listening to those whose backgrounds are different than our own. So what BRAID has done is we've organized a quarterly webinar series to highlight accessibility issues within the atmospheric and related sciences. So I want to thank you today for joining our webinar series on cognitive and learning disabilities. Our next webinar series will be in January 2021, just after the AMS annual meeting. And so some of these kind of topics that will be covered are mental health issues, physical disabilities, etc. So thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to a great discussion. Mary?
Thanks, Aaron. So I'm Mary Glackin. I'm the current president of AMS. I'm retired from previous jobs. I spent most of my career at NOAA and the last 5 years or so in the private sector, including at IBM, the weather company. So it's really a pleasure. You know, we've started this series, as Aaron said, and it's been great, I think, and I'm really excited about this afternoon's panel. The way we're going to do this is we're going to start with some self-introductions, and then we have a little bit to share with you about the kind of disabilities that we're talking about here, and then we'll move on to some questions. And I do want to point out there's an area in your GoToWebinar to submit questions, so feel free to go ahead and do that. We'll try to get to them online as much as possible. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on the introductions. And Matt, I'd like to ask you to go first, if you would, and you know, share in addition to telling us kind of where you are in your career, share whatever you're comfortable with any condition. So Matt.
Sure, thanks, Mary. Can you just confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm Matt Bolton. I'm a first-year graduate student at St. Leo University in Florida. I actually am pursuing a master's degree in psychology, and I studied the psychology of weather. I'll talk about a little bit of the research I've done today in that area on meteorologists, but I'll be speaking today on experiences with autism and ADHD.
Great, thanks, thanks, Matt. And Manda, would you like to go next?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Manda Chasten. I'm a PhD candidate in meteorology at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm employed through the Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies, more commonly known as SIMS. So I'm going to be talking about my journey with ADHD in graduate school. I actually was diagnosed with ADHD a year into my PhD, so I was 25 at the time. So it's relatively new to me. It's something that I've been dealing with, you know, my whole life, but only really knew about it for the past couple of years. So.
Thanks, Manda. Kevin?
So, yes, hello, I'm Kevin Hyke, meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in Duluth, Minnesota. And I have been diagnosed with ADHD without the hyperactivity component when I was a child, and then diagnosed with autism a few years ago as an adult. And been dealing with some of those challenges for my entire life without really having the tools or the language to describe what was going on. So glad to be part of the panel today.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And JP?
Hi, I'm JP Calp. I'm a meteorologist who's currently working as a contract driver observer at the San Jose Airport here in San Jose, California. I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome back in 5th grade, but they merged Asperger's into autism, so technically I am on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
I'm an early career professional, as I'm still trying to find a job within the field itself. So I'll talk to you whenever I can about my own experiences in job hunting and how I did in school in that area.
Yeah. Thanks, JP. And JP has a great suggestion for us to consider as a community too. So, okay. Well, as promised, I'm going to ask Matt and Amanda to share just a few slides with you, just to make sure. I mean, I think we've all heard these words in our either personal or professional life, but I think you'll agree after you've heard them that it's great. They've done what we do in scientists and really put some data around it. So it's kind of great to see that. So there we go. So Matt, you could start.
All right. So autism is a set of neurological conditions marked by difficulties with social communication, unusually narrow and repetitive interests, repetitive behaviors, and sensory sensitivities. It occurs in 1 in 54 individuals, which equates to about 3.5 million Americans. And I've actually done some research on autism in meteorology, and we find that meteorologists actually score highly on tests of autistic traits. And so what are these autistic traits? What are some patterns of behavior that are observed across the spectrum? This is a non-exhaustive list, but you have social difficulties, which extends verbal communication, nonverbal communication. There's a whole host of different difficulties there. You have the stereotypically deep passion or interest. You can have strengths or weaknesses in pattern recognition and visual spatial skills. You get the behavioral psychological rigidity and insistence on sameness, need for sameness, executive functioning weaknesses, so things like working memory, planning, task coordination, attention switching, those weaknesses overlap with ADHD. And something that Amanda actually will talk about within ADHD, another overlap that's a positive and can be a positive, can be a negative depending on the context, is that many autistic people, and this links back to the pattern recognition, and it links back to the deep passions that many people on the spectrum have, is the ability to intensely focus. And finally, I wanted to highlight sensory sensitivities, which I've just got 3 examples here, but these can be either hypersensitivities, where you have extremes of sensitivity, or hyposensitivity, where you have lower levels of sensitivity. Amanda?
Yeah, so what is ADHD? So ADHD basically comes in 3 sort of types. The first is inattention, the second is hyperactivity, and the third is a combined type. And it tends to be characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And as an adult, these symptoms are actually, or this condition is diagnosed when the symptoms are actually bound to make your life more difficult in terms of your social, academic, or in your job, for example. So when you go to get diagnosed, they look at how this has affected your performance at work. So it is a little bit different as being diagnosed as a child. And 1 in 30 adults actually have ADHD. So if you don't have ADHD, you probably know somebody who does. The next slide. So as I said, there are 3 main types of ADHD. The primarily inattentive type is what was formerly known as ADD. So ADD and ADHD are actually the same thing. They do have similarities. The hyperactivity part is where you have problems paying attention. You may be really have excessive activity or difficulty controlling behavior. You struggle to sit still, which is kind of the stereotype of that. Can you click to the, okay. So some symptoms of inattention are difficulty staying focused, especially if it's something that's not really engaging mentally, difficulty keeping deadlines, forgetfulness. So that comes back to sort of working memory, and you know, you may be going to do something and you forget what you're doing completely, losing things regularly, getting easily distracted, making careless mistakes. And then one thing that I'd like to really emphasize is a difficulty in keeping things organized and tidy. So people with ADHD actually have a really hard time organizing and planning ahead. And for hyperactivity and impulsivity, these symptoms are difficulty sitting still, feeling restless or impatient, being talkative or interrupting others, intruding into or taking over what others are doing. So an example of that could be if somebody asks you for help, you may tend to sort of go over the top and do more than they kind of wanted you to, but your intentions are good. And the last is acting quickly without thinking, so being impulsive. And so this is kind of just going through what I just said, but how these may affect your life at work and school. So disorganization obviously is going to make it hard to plan tasks and plan for projects. And also, if you're juggling a lot of different things, can be really difficult for people to deal with. And also the inability to prioritize. So it's hard for people with ADHD to realize, you know, if you have a lot of things to do, what is the most important thing to do, and in what order should you do things? Another thing is issues with authority. And so people with ADHD may be more willing to, or more likely to, you know, conflict with a superior or something like that, which can lead to issues at work. And just some others like forgetfulness. So if you forget to, you know, respond to an email or do something you're supposed to do, obviously that's going to be a problem. So there's also a lot of strengths of people with ADHD. And as Matt mentioned, hyperfocus can be one if it's directed in a way that's actually productive. So if you get really immersed into your work, that's obviously something that's productive. Whereas if you are supposed to be doing something and you spend all your time playing video games or something like that, and you focus your energy in not a productive way, then obviously that's going to take away from what you're supposed to be doing. But people with ADHD are also tend to be really curious and eager to learn. They're highly intuitive, very, very creative people. They provide a lot of out-of-the-box thinking, unique perspectives and original ideas. So that makes them really good problem solvers, and they come from a different place maybe than you may typically see with other people. And it's a lot of it's because they tend to consider a lot of different possibilities, and they can connect things, different ideas together pretty well. And they tend to be really hardworking. And so one thing is that a lot of people with ADHD, to kind of accomplish as much as the normal person, has to actually put in a lot more effort and a lot more time. And so they tend to, at least if you're going to be you know, successful and try to be successful, you really do have to learn to be disciplined, and that's something that's challenging. And another thing that's actually really cool about ADHD is that people tend to perform well in highly stressful or rapidly changing situations. And so that may be a really good benefit for somebody in the weather service, for example, when they're dealing with these unfolding weather events. And so one thing I'll talk about, I guess, just as a grad student is how you can really support grad students with ADHD. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of work or resources that are available for this after students get out of coursework and into their research. And because grad school basically has minimal structure and requires a lot of independent learning and time management, can be really challenging for people with ADHD because that's something that they really struggle with, especially when dealing with, sort of open-ended long-term research projects. So the struggles that they face are actually a lot different than what undergrads tend to struggle with. And so I reference here an article that I found that's actually for optometry students, but it was really helpful in that it suggested that faculty advisors basically provide mentorship, empathy, and understanding. So talking to your students about, what they're going through, what could actually help them, set clear expectations, and closely monitor their progress, and provide direct and timely feedback is really essential. Basically imposing structure on them because it's difficult for them to kind of do it themselves. And so imposing structure on them and making sure that they're held accountable is something that's really essential. And another thing is distraction-free workspaces. And so a lot of grad students tend to work in open offices or offices with several other people. But this is actually a huge challenge for people with ADHD who tend to get distracted and may work a lot better if they were in their own office, for example. And here I just list some resources. So this PowerPoint will actually be available to all of you after the webinar. So you're able to go back and sort of look at these, and hopefully they're helpful.
Thanks, Amanda and Matt. I think that was great. And I suspect some of the people in the audience may have been as surprised as I was to see how common these conditions are. And, there's probably lots of people that are undiagnosed for sure in older generations. So I want to go back. I think we should start this discussion about, it was great that Amanda kind of laid a foundation for what's happening, her experiences in academia. But I want to dig into that a little bit further because things tend to be very structured in, K through 12 kind of thing. And then you move into graduate school, undergraduate school, new location on. I know we have a lot of attendees that are on the webinar today from academia. So would somebody like to elaborate a little bit from your experiences in undergraduate school and what was really helpful there and what wasn't helpful?
Among the helpful things I had as a undergraduate student was I had note-taking services, as that was something my school offered. I especially used it during my meteorology classes. Since there was a small group, so we all knew who the best note taker was.
So that was pretty helpful. Yeah. Anything else, Matt? You're at, you've been through, well, everybody here has been through undergraduate school. Anything you want to add, Matt?
I actually, speaking from something of an interesting situation, I think many students, if they're listening today, can relate to with COVID. My master's program actually, it's in psychology, but it's entirely online. And so looking at, I'll speak to that in a moment, but my undergrad actually was very much a mixed delivery. So I had some on-ground classes and then some that were online. And so I had this really interesting attention switching battle because, on one hand here, I've got these really concrete on-ground classes where everything's really, it's I guess more supportive of the student. In an online environment, you are fully focused on your own learning. You're the driver of the train here. And so to really push yourself and to be consistently motivated, I think is one challenge within that. But for me in undergrad, I was constantly switching between, okay, I've got this on ground class that is, we're all kind of supportive of each other, and we have these structured in-person meetings that can kind of push you along. But then I had these other classes that were online, and it was all on my shoulders, and that's where I'm at now with graduate school. Everything is on me. And
Yeah.
so I think the biggest thing I would really recommend, regardless of if you have ADHD, autism, or any other condition, or if you're even neurotypical, this helps, is cut your tasks down into a chunk and as small a piece as you can. Really get down to the micro level. And so you're able to manage it more efficiently. Those pieces don't overwhelm you, and you're able to just focus on one tiny thing and then move outward and slowly extrapolate those tasks into their larger components. It's funny, people have always asked me how I'm so productive with my ADHD and attention issues. And really what it is I am focusing on one thing, maybe for 10, 20 minutes. Those are 10 super, super productive minutes. And then I'm, on to the next thing. And so I might do, 10 to 20 minutes worth of work on 3 or 4 different papers in a day. And so that can feel like, from a personal standpoint, that I'm not making progress on things or that things aren't moving forward. But really what that's doing is it's incremental productivity, and that incremental productivity over time builds up. And so you apply that to your schoolwork, you apply that to your goals, and it allows you to keep track of things much more easily and efficiently.
There's some great tips there, great tips. Kevin, did you want to add to this discussion?
What the things that JP and Matt both mentioned are, are very good suggestions. I can see situations in my education where those may have been helpful. Certainly, definitely the time management and so forth is a struggle, especially for people who have both ADHD and autism. The other issue that cropped up in my education was the communication component, and being able to effectively communicate expectations and standards of work and standards of behavior between my professors and myself during my education. And those challenges don't go away when you leave school for a person with autism. Those struggles continue even into the workplace with communication and so forth.
Right. Okay. If there's nothing more on this topic, I wanted to, I'm going to go a little bit off the script we had. And Matt, you really kind of teased us in your introductions about looking at meteorologists and, the skills they have here. Can you say a little bit more about that? And there's actually, I'm just going to pull a question here. Well, let me leave it at that. If you could say a little bit more about your research there. I think it's really interesting.
Sure. So I actually have 2 different lines of research that deal with meteorologists. One focuses on mental health and personality, the interplay of those various traits. And then the other is on connections between autism and science. And so with respect to autism and science, 20 some odd years ago now, autism was first linked to engineers. And so engineers they tend to have a higher prevalence of autism in their families and tend to have a higher degree of autistic traits. So those characteristics I mentioned at the beginning. This was extended to other physical scientists, to individuals in information technology. And so what seems to be linking autism and science and linking these fields is that these individuals are drawn to really analytical thinking, pattern-based thinking. It's kind of a heuristic, if you will, this kind of if-then type causal relationship, and we see those in meteorology. you know, if this happens, this is going to be the result. And so the research that I've done actually linked those same traits in meteorologists, and I found that meteorologists score similarly on tests of generalized autistic traits and on detail orientation as engineers and physicists. And so that's been an interesting line of work for me. There actually was a related paper last year in the Journal of Operational Meteorology that talked about something called cognitive disembedding, and how meteorologists are strong in cognitive disembedding. Cognitive disembedding is basically the ability to discern details and patterns. So it's taking tiny pieces of information from an overall whole. And so the researchers linked performance on mesoanalysis, on weather map analysis, to this cognitive disembedding detail orientation skill. And so the better you are with detail orientation and picking out those details, the better you tend to be at weather map reading and analysis. So it's all interesting convergent research. But the other line of work that I do deals with mental health and personality. And what I found there is that meteorologists tend to be more agreeable than other physical scientists. They tend to be more conscientious, and they tend to be within broadcasters. This is a subsector employment field specific finding. Broadcasters tend to be the most extroverted. Just for an example of some of those findings. With respect to mental health, meteorologists tend to be relatively stable. The agreeableness, the extroversion, conscientiousness, etc., those personality traits seem to buffer different negative mental health outcomes. And then when you get into different variables like, for example, self-concept clarity, so knowing who you are as a person, there don't seem to be differences between meteorologists in those kinds of traits, or life satisfaction, for example. And so that would indicate, or it would seem to indicate, that meteorologists tend to be pretty stable on those kinds of traits as far as life satisfaction, grit, you know, kind of that stick-to-itiveness. And that goes back to conscientiousness. But on the whole, less depressed, less stressed than other physical scientists. That was the comparison group in the autism study. We actually looked at autism and mental health between meteorologists, physicists, and engineers. And so from a job sector standpoint, they're completely different job descriptions, but we were using those as a comparison group because of the autism research.
Yeah.
But on the whole, more stable than other physical scientists.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So I think several of you have made the points that really when these conditions exist, there are definitely strong positives here that would point to success in a field like meteorology. Yet we know people have a hard time often getting employed, especially I think kind of getting the first job and the foot in the door. And I'd like to talk about that a little more too. And so somebody, I think JP, you kind of started with, you know, looking for another employment, you know, moving beyond a contract observer. Can you kind of share your experience? And as I kind of gave a teaser earlier, you have a recommendation that employers might consider.
Yeah, yeah, I'm actually trying to find a new job in the field of meteorology, as I've been out of school for a few years now. Some of the biggest weaknesses I've had is definitely the interviews, for sure. Since as Matt and Amanda pointed out on the slides from earlier. They talked about like how we're better at, we can do things that come up quickly. Like in my own personal experience as a weather observer, I've had thunderstorms come up, as well as a power outage at the airport itself once. I managed to think on my feet on those situations. And as there was already something there I could use to see like, all right, what do I do? Here it is. While interviews, it's a bit of a different animal, let's say. It's like really having to think about it like, should I say this or should I say that? Or since sometimes I wouldn't know what type of questions would come up.
Yeah. It's really a communications test as opposed to any kind of test in your skills, I think is what you're saying. The interview is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Can I add something here? I just had a thought, because I deal with this too, JP. Not in an interview context, but just interpersonally. I get the sense that what you're talking about is self-monitoring, and so within the interview, you're really self-monitoring yourself and trying to figure out, your own impression. What is your impression on the other individual? And that can then lead to all kinds of other difficulties as you try to perceive that. Would that be kind of what you're talking about as well?
Yeah, exactly. Since I've been taking therapy for a few years, which helped me with some of the interviews, but sadly to no avail. Have
So
one idea.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mary.
Well, I was going to say you've had an idea that would kind of change the interview process on its head. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I was actually about to get into that, actually.
Great.
One idea I heard about from my therapy sessions was the idea of a reverse job fair or reverse career fair, where the employers such as AccuWeather, Weather Underground, or even on NWS meteorologists in charge would come up to the individual and talk to the person instead of the prospective employee going up to the booths like we have at the normal career fairs. Just the opposite.
Right, right. And I think another thing that we talked about as we were preparing for this webinar is, I can't remember the name of the employer, but they actually wanted to employ more people with these conditions because they knew they needed these skill sets. So instead of running a typical interview where they asked a lot of questions, it was very skills based. Here's a problem, solve this problem. So, which is JP says, is something he can do well, present it with the problem itself and not having to worry about all the communication around the problem. And I thought that was really fascinating. I can't remember the name of the company, but it was very interesting. So, anybody want to add anything else on getting the job, the first job? How about you, Kevin? Is there anything you want to chime in here? It's so competitive to get in the National Weather Service these days. I can't imagine it was easy for you.
No, it took quite a number of years before I started even getting to the point where I was receiving interview requests. And in my experience, attending conferences and getting to know people and participating in panels such as this one were all important pieces for my career advancement. Getting to know individuals outside of the interview and application process, and trying to build those relationships. Of course, with the way that we're having to do things now to protect our health, it makes it a little bit more challenging. but certainly any opportunity to participate in a group setting and find people to talk to, and trying to target those relationships and build relationships with individuals who are in a position to, make decisions about employment or influence people who are making decisions. I got to know quite a few science and operations officers during the time when I was trying to applying for jobs in the National Weather Service. I went to conferences, got to know Suze, asked questions, and just tried to advertise myself a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get to the interview process, I mean, the things that JP mentioned as far as, not really, communication from an autism spectrum perspective tends to be very direct. And so I would miss the point of some of the interview questions. You'd get a question where it's somewhat open-ended, and then in a neurotypical person, or perhaps a person in a different type of neurodivergence, may be able to take that thread and run with it. And there were times when I was giving short answers, and then there was, a lot of quiet afterward and a lot of dead air while they were waiting for me to expand without actually saying to expand on my answer, things like that. So those are some of the things that I've encountered in my travels, if you will.
Yeah, great. Let's move on. Let's turn this around to the employer's perspective. So we'll move ourselves to the time frame of you landed a job. So Amanda said, she had some suggestions for accommodations in like graduate school and things like that. And I would imagine some of those would carry over maybe to the workforce, trying to limit distractions and all. But does anybody want to comment on that? What they might recommend for employers to do for accommodation to make it a more successful employee relationship?
Yeah, I've got a few ideas.
Go ahead, JP.
Some of these ideas based on what we've been talking about. One idea is get to know the person, like know if they're more if quiet folks best for them, or if a busy office space with limit, where there's a lot of interaction versus minimal interaction, for example, like what Amanda was talking about in her own struggles, or was at least talking about with her experience at graduate school. Since every person's different on the autism spectrum, I can handle being on my own. I work best when I'm on my own. Versus I can do well in the office where people are talking and there's a lot of noise, like TV's going on, that type of thing.
Right.
It's all about just what the employee, it varies from employee to employee.
Right.
Yeah, I think one thing, if you're comfortable talking to your boss or your employer about your condition, that's one thing, although a lot of people probably aren't. But I guess one thing that would be maybe helpful is just, if you can't be in your own office, which most people probably can't in grad school, and also like in the weather service, for example, it's just allowing, your employees to wear headphones with white noise is actually really helpful for me. And noise canceling headphones can be expensive, so that may be something that an employer could actually help or provide their employees with. Oh, and another thing, if they aren't required to work 9 to 5 or some set shift, having flexible work hours I found to be really helpful. So I tend to focus better in the evenings than at night, personally. And so one way I kind of managed to deal with working in offices with other people where I couldn't get anything done was that I basically just shifted my schedule to where I worked at night when no one was in the office. And that worked for me because I have like circadian rhythm disorders and other things that I can actually focus better at night anyway, although that's probably not true for a lot of people. But that's something that I did personally to just accommodate, the situation I was in even before I was diagnosed with ADHD. And that's good in terms of productivity, but I will say has a really horrible effect on your work-life balance and your mental health and stuff like that. And so there are a lot of sacrifices you have to make if you are, taking these sort of unconventional approaches to trying to manage the situation you're in. But that's just kind of the experience that I've had.
One thing that I wanted to bring up, especially in terms of employment and successfully being able to engage with people on the autism spectrum, is the importance of clear communication between leadership and management and the autistic individual. Clear expectation of behaviors, of tasks, and when making corrections and adjustments, trying to help the employee succeed, pointing to specific examples is incredibly helpful. I myself, once I see a couple of examples, I'm able to build a mental model of how a thing works, including expectations of behavior, expectations of style of work, of substance of work, after seeing a few examples, and then I can run off of that model for a long time. But if I don't have the clear examples, it's very difficult for me to build the model. And then in those situations are where I can run into some difficulties performing at the level that's expected. Always, be specific. Generalities are where I've run into problems in the past, thinking that I have a good understanding of what my supervisor is asking me to do, and then I find myself well off into the weeds or hyper-focusing, as Matt mentioned, and spending a considerable amount of time getting into details that weren't necessary to the project, but seemed relevant and, more importantly, seemed interesting at the time that I was looking at them. And so I can find myself with some time management issues if I'm given too broad and too generic of a specification on a task. And then the other one is receiving communication. People on the autism spectrum, at least from the reading I've done and from my own experiences personally, tend to be very direct in their communication. And that's not as common among neurotypical people. And the direct communication can come across as confrontational. It can come across as aggressive. It can come across as malcontent and so forth. And it's very rare that the autistic person is having those emotions and those feelings when they're just communicating as normal. But the recipient of that very direct communication can apply their own emotions to that communication, and then that adds another dimension that an autistic person may not be aware of, may not have intended, etc. So most of the challenges that I've experienced are not with doing the work, but in the communication aspect, both with peers, clients, supervisors, etc.
So those are great comments, great comments. I want to move on to one of the questions that's been submitted by the audience. And I love this question. It says, as friends and colleagues, how can we help you feel welcomed and included? And if somebody wanted to start on that, including how we use terminology about these conditions.
Okay.
Matt, maybe do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll jump in. And this is good. It actually links back to something I wanted to say to Kevin on what he was talking about with generalities in the workplace. I think something that within the workplace we can do within the weather enterprise is normalize for people with neurological difficulties, whether that's autism, ADHD, dyslexia, maybe a math disability or something. Normalize that it's okay for that individual to ask for help. Because so often we feel like if we ask for help or if we need to clarify, so going back to Kevin, with specific examples, if our mental model is speaking to us and telling us that there's this one very narrow interpretation, we need to feel comfortable that we can clarify that that is indeed the correct interpretation. We need to perhaps have help seeing the generalities, and we need to feel comfortable being able to ask for that information. And so in a workplace environment, that's one thing I would suggest to really normalize within the office culture or the workplace culture, that it's okay to ask for help. And to do that, you have to have a baseline empathy. You have to have a baseline level of acceptance and tolerance, and you have to be able to work with these individuals in a patient manner and allow them to feel that positive regard and to feel that sense of your being genuine within the workplace, so they can feel comfortable. From a social standpoint, I would say recognize that the individual in most situations is doing their best. So often, and this is just across the board, I've dealt interpersonally with people who are very quick to interpret my understanding. They don't take the time to really step back and say, okay, where is he really coming from in communicating this? And that's where that lack of perspective taking, it's actually called the double empathy problem. They call it in the autism literature. It's the non-autistic person being unempathetic and not taking perspective, and then putting it all on the autistic person within the relationship. And basically, the non-autistic people are having just as much difficulty relating to the autistic person as the autistic person is having relating to them. And we don't recognize that often enough. We don't step back and say, maybe it's not them, maybe it's me, and maybe there are some things I need to work on. And it's difficult for a lot of people to recognize that. I think there's a high degree of humility within that, and it affects autistic communication, autistic neurotypical communication. It affects neurotypical ADHD communication because the person has their perceptions and assumptions of the person with ADHD. But I would say that's one of the biggest things. If we can have a little bit more empathy and perspective taking about those interactions all the way around, and just put a little more self-reflection into it. Be willing to make space for the autistic person to communicate within their means and abilities, and don't place undue and unnecessary expectations and pressure on them to conform to another standard. Let them come to you and then meet them where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
That's great, Matt. Anybody else, any tips you would give the audience for, their, in dealing with their coworkers and all, that beyond what Matt has just recommended?
Yeah, I've got something. Since I've started a video blog or a vlog on my life as an autistic individual, one thing I've noticed on the autism Twitter feed has been said the preferred term of usage is autistic person or autistic individual instead of like
Mhm.
an individual with autism,
Mhm.
since the autism is part of who we are as an individual.
So just to be clear, you're recommending an autistic person as opposed to a person with autism?
Yes.
Okay,
Identity first over person first.
yeah,
Mhm.
great.
Whereas with ADHD or another condition, it would be person first. And I'll just briefly add, with respect to autism, I often use autism spectrum condition rather than disorder because a condition can reflect a state of being. It can reflect a medical condition. It can reflect a disability without being stigmatizing.
Mhm.
And I think it
Right.
shows the power of, just simple word substitution. But my favorite is that you can actually say person with an autism spectrum condition. So you can actually fit the standard and the medical model and what people normally do with this language. You can use person first using autism spectrum condition because it does recognize an implicit inherent state of being, it actually is referencing an autistic state of being. And so it's kind of circular to arrive at the logic, but when you realize it, it's actually very powerful because you can use autism spectrum condition either way,
Mhm.
even in a person first context. And it kind of subverts that stigmatizing narrative of
Mhm.
the medical model and of the person first language.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, Mary. One thing I would add, and I guess with regard to the ADHD point, kind of, I guess what we were talking about a little bit earlier, but realizing that people with ADHD tend to struggle most with things that most people think are simple, and we may be really good at things that are difficult for other people. And so, making lists and planning, responding to emails, stuff like that may be really difficult for us, but we may be able to solve really complex problems. And so when it comes down to, in a work environment, just having, mentors or colleagues that are willing to sort of team up with the person that may have this condition and help them with those sort of basic things that they find really difficult is probably really essential because in my sort of experience, those things, oftentimes the simple things is just organizing, compartmentalizing, making, an outline for a paper or something can be kind of crippling, whereas just writing the paper is actually a lot easier for us. And it may be really inefficient, but it's kind of the only way that we can sort of work because we have a lot of trouble with planning. So I think just making sure you have colleagues that can complement you and work with you and stuff like that is really, really essential.
Yeah, I think the other thing I heard implicit in what you were saying, Manda, is people shouldn't make assumptions because, as you said, maybe you struggle with something that looks like it's simple, but it's not simple for you, but you can actually do this more complex thing. And I would imagine there are people that would just make an assumption that, if you can't do this, no way you can do that, but it's actually not true there. So that's
And
great.
that holds true for people on the autism spectrum as well. I have strengths and weaknesses just like everyone else, and some of the weaknesses come in that communication aspect, but the technical abilities and the ability to hyper focus and ignore some distraction really tends to be a strength of mine.
Yeah,
Definitely.
right. Yeah. So we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I want to read this question that we have gotten online, though, to see if anybody can add to this. They're asking whether any of us have seen the intersectionality between being a person of color and having one of these conditions play out in comparison to those who identify as white and have one of these conditions. So we really do have an all-white panel here today.
Multiple
So-
marginalization. It's a difficult thing. I can speak to, just from my own reading and research to try to understand the perspective a little bit better. I can speak to experiences of autistic people of color, for example. There's often discussion about white autistic people that there is a degree of privilege within that, because even though they have autism, they still have that that protective factor that unfortunately is the color of their skin. You know, I would prefer that we went beyond all these labels and just looked at the human individual. But unfortunately, society doesn't see it that way. And so if you're an autistic person of color, you've got this multiple marginalization. You have to worry about perceptions of what it means to be autistic. You have to worry about perceptions of what it means to be Black, or, you know, maybe you're a Hispanic person, or maybe you're Asian. Anytime you get intersectionality and multiple labels, it adds a huge amount of stress on the individual, because they're having to consider so many other factors as well. And the person walking down the street next to them doesn't even have to think about any of those things, 9 times out of 10.
Yeah.
I think about, for example, there was in Miami last year, there was an African American autistic man on the beach, and he was with his caretaker, and he got shot by the police because they came to the scene responding to quote unquote violent individual, and he was just having some sensory issues. Caretaker was dealing with it and helping to de-escalate the situation, and the police shot him simply because he was African American, and they made assumptions about the situation.
Mhm.
And we see that over and over and over again where this intersectionality is concerned. And even for just white people in general who are on the spectrum, and, you know, with these different communication disorders, when you're nonverbal or you have trouble responding, maybe you're not nonverbal, but you have trouble responding anyway to communication, you know, following the orders of police or whomever is there can be difficult. And so you have all these different concerns. And I know for me, just masking, you know, my traits and things on a daily basis is extremely stressful. And so to add in all these other factors,
Right.
it's just unfathomable.
Yeah.
But I hope that can kind of speak to,
Yeah.
I wish I could speak to that perspective more.
I would suspect all of you, I should have asked this to the panelists earlier, but you'd be happy. We're out of time now. There were more questions there, but I would suspect if people wanted to reach out to you directly, you would be happy, or they could reach out to me and I could coordinate any follow-up anybody would like on the seminar.
Could we maybe put our emails in the chat or something and then have those be there?
Yeah, or we could, why don't we put them when we post the stuff with the recording of the webinar, we'll have it there. But if you want to throw it, I don't know that the attendees can actually see the chat itself. I'm not sure, maybe so. But feel free, but it would be easy enough to add those to what we'll post. So, and if you're in the AMS community, you can find us anyway. You can send us a message through the AMS community. So. Okay, well, I think we're at the top of the hour, so I really want to thank the panelists. I think that, you know, Erin started us out this way, that we need to be educated more than we are, and you took us a long way on that today. So thank you very much, and best wishes, and everybody out there, please stay safe these days. Take care.